Amen. All right. Well, thank you so much for giving me this time. I have taken a little bit of time off from my ministry to do some country living. And before you do country living, you need to have a place in the country. So we've been working on our place out here in Oklahoma and really been enjoying that. But it is such a pleasure. And by the way, I was kind of forced in this position because all of our public health seminars were canceled after COVID came into the picture. So looking forward to the day where we can actually have some public health seminars again. But for now, this is the next best thing. So thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to be talking about the immune system today, specifically dealing with what you can do as far as lifestyle, as far as simple natural remedies to, I wouldn't say boost your immune system, because for some people that wouldn't be such a good thing. It's kind of like this. We're waiting for God's people to be ready for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. If we're not ready, we shouldn't have the Holy Spirit. So if your immune system is not ready, it should not be boosted. So we need to figure out how to modulate and moderate things, make sure that our lifestyles are conducive to a healthy life or a healthy lifestyle or a healthy immune system, and then learn how to amplify that response. So we're going to be looking at those simple things that we can do to solve this. So I have some slides here, and I'm going to go ahead and pull those up. And we're going to be talking about something I like to call viral wellness worth sharing. And this is definitely worth sharing. I came up with this presentation a long time ago, actually during the Ebola pandemic or epidemic there in sub-Saharan Africa a number of years ago. But I've since changed it around, and now it's tailored towards the coronavirus, believe it or not. And it's something that each one of us, we need to have a knowledge of how our immune system works, because it's our army. And God has given us this army so that we can fight against new infections. One thing that a lot of people don't realize, unless they're reading the Bible, is that these things are going to happen more and more frequently. We're told in Matthew 24, pestilence is a sign of the nearness of Christ's coming. And we know that his coming is very near because all the prophecies have been fulfilled up until this point, where we're just kind of waiting. We're wondering, how long is it going to be? Is it going to be a year? Is it going to be 2 years? Is it going to be 3 years? We're all interested in this as Advent believers. But while we have an interest in this, we also need to realize that there are things that are happening in the world that are prophetic. And one of these is worldwide, or at least localized, epidemics and pandemics. We're going to see more and more of these. So we need to be ready. And this is what this readiness is all about. So let's get into this pandemic that we're focused on in today's day and age. This is a headline from CNN Health. This was a early headline dealing with asymptomatic people. Infected people without symptoms might be driving the spread of coronavirus more than we realized. How is it that people can become infected with the coronavirus yet show no symptoms, and yet eventually get over the coronavirus without even showing symptoms? Well, it's not something that's a bad thing. The media is kind of purporting that this is a bad thing to have asymptomatic people without symptoms. It's not a good thing because we need to know that they're sick. Well, if everyone was asymptomatic, we would all be okay, because everyone's immune system would be fighting this virus in such a way that it would not develop into a severe set of symptoms and pathophysiology, including even leading to death. There are symptoms that occur because damage has occurred, or because maybe an aberrant immune response or a strange immune response is happening. But if we look at the origins of this virus, which is purported to be the bat, we can understand that the bats are largely asymptomatic with these coronaviruses. In fact, the bats can hold, they're kind of the reservoir of a lot of different viruses and a lot of different coronaviruses. I believe there are 40 distinct coronaviruses they've isolated from bats, if I remember correctly. And when bats get stressed, we're told in the the journal Viruses in 2019, it said reproductive and nutritional stress can increase the levels of virus in little red flying foxes. The increase in virus replication may enhance the chances of a virus spillover. So think about this for a minute. We're told that it's no longer safe to eat the flesh of animals because the time will come, well, I'm kind of inferring based on this next statement, the time will come when it won't be safe because of the diseases in animals. It won't be safe to eat the flesh of animals. Now, it was never safe to eat bats. That's something that was prohibited there in Leviticus. But the world around us is crumbling. And it's not just humanity, it's the whole animal kingdom. And we're seeing these diseases emerge. And I think a lot of these new pestilences that it's referring to in Matthew 24, they're being harbored right now by these animals, and the animals are just becoming so sick that these viruses are, the viral titer or levels of the virus can increase so much that it increases the possibility of a spillover, of some type of a mutation occurring, and now it's infectious to humans. And if we look at that quote from the journal Viruses, it says that when bats are under a lot of duress, then it's more likely you're going to have a human infection from a bat virus. Sounds very similar to something that Sister White said in Counsels on Diet and Foods, page 286. Some animals, quote, that are brought to the slaughter seem to realize by instinct what is to take place, and they become furious, literally mad. They are killed while at that state, and their flesh is prepared for market. That's very interesting because we're told that the coronavirus might have originated in a seafood market that was selling bats as food, or other animals that might have had some type of infection stemming from the bat as well. And these animals were not treated well. We know they're in cages, they're in probably very poor environments, and they're stressed, they're worried, they're anxious, they have feelings too. And it's just kind of sad to see that we're bringing this upon ourselves by the way we're treating God's creation around us. So a lot could be said just for being good stewards of the world around us, by considering the needs of even the animal creatures, which is something that a lot of people overlook. So just my little aside there. But if we want to have a healthy immune system, it also starts with being kind to the creatures around us. That would include our family, even our spouses, for those of you who are going through some issues, because stress can affect us as well. And the more we're affected by this duress, the more that we could have symptomatic responses, or from things that would normally not bother us, or even pass infections on to others. So what is good for the animals, which is a healthy lifestyle, being able to handle stress, is also good for us as well. So let's look a little bit more at the coronavirus. And specifically, I want to ask the question, what does this virus do to the immune system? And how does the immune system interact with this virus? These are the questions we need to answer if we're going to understand how we can prepare the immune system to fight it. So this next slide is very startling because it shows us that the virus actually attacks the immune system. Some of you may be thinking, well, I thought it only attacked the lungs, so we get shortness of breath and so on and so forth. That's a later aspect of the infection. The real danger is when our immune system is weakened by the virus and it does not fight the infection effectively early on. So here's some big words. Don't worry, I'll explain what they mean. And by the time we're finished with this presentation, you'll really understand more of what these cells are capable of and what they can do to help you with coronavirus. Okay, so leukopenia means you have low levels of white blood cells in the blood. 47% of patients, and this is dealing with the first SARS, that coronavirus that occurred in Asia back a number of years ago. But we can compare the two because they are very similar. I believe there's a 70% genetic identity with this this current coronavirus and SARS, the original SARS. So low white blood cells, that's not a good thing, especially if you're going to be fighting the virus with white blood cells. Lymphopenia, which are your lymphocytes, and 84% of people having low levels of lymphocytes, and we'll discuss that in just a moment what that actually is. But these numbers are startling. T lymphopenia in 95%. Helper T cell levels, the CD4 T cells. These are the ones that kind of scout around and find the viruses or the viral infected cells, and they report it to other, they're also called antigen presenting cells. They will report this to other immune cells, which will then verify and mount a counterattack against the viruses. So it says in 100% of these patients, they had reduced levels of helper T cells. That doesn't sound like a good thing, doesn't it? Or does it? Okay, CD8 T lymphocytes were reduced in 87%, and B lymphocyte levels were reduced by 76%. Now here's the one that's, in my opinion, the very worst. Natural killer cell levels were reduced in 55%. So our data suggested that these patients' immune systems were impaired during the course of SARS. It really brings to mind the fact that we need to have our immune systems ready. It's kind of like having an army that's not being trained, that's not being prepared, and there are deadly threats all around. It's kind of presumptuous to think that you're going to be okay in the long run, because eventually something's going to happen. In the same sense, we need to have our immune systems prepared for the inevitable, for these viruses, for these pestilences that are coming around. And we know that we've had so many of them. I would say that this past century has been the century of the virus. We've had so many very dangerous viruses come onto the scene. And I believe this is just one of those signs of the times. We are going to see more and more and more of these things as we go along. One of the viruses that caused the most devastation throughout the last 100 years, actually a little over 100 years now, was something that came from the birds, avian influenza, that occurred in 1918. It killed more people than World War I. It's actually known as the flu that killed a war. It sent the soldiers were dying in the trenches, and they had to go home, and they didn't fare much better there. And this virus went around the world, maybe a little slower than viruses do today, but nonetheless, it still killed millions upon millions of people. Some estimates suggest anywhere from 40 to 60 million people were killed by this pandemic. And as a result of this pandemic, we had things like martial law. This is in the streets of San Francisco. If you didn't wear a mask there in San Francisco, then you could face some pretty severe consequences. One gentleman refused to wear a mask, and he was boarding a streetcar, and an officer shot him, I think in the leg. Didn't kill him, but nonetheless, that's a pretty severe response for not wearing a mask. So we might complain about having to wear a mask in today's day and age, but I think in 1918, they might have been even a little more strict at times. I haven't heard of anyone being shot yet because of not wearing a mask. But suffice it to say, they faced restrictions of liberty. They were not allowed to do certain things.
He was going into that mask thing.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you had said. Someone said something about a mask.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I think they didn't mute it. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You know, we'll talk more about masks, because there's an important aspect to wearing a mask that a lot of people are unaware of, and we'll go through that through the research when we get into that a little bit more into that subject. Okay, so a lot of restrictions, a lot of issues. Here's one. No, that's not the slide I'm looking for. I'm looking for this one right here, which was a newspaper clipping from Middlebury, Vermont. In Middlebury, Vermont, on October 4th, 1918. It said, death toll and sick list is one of the heaviest on record. Practically every state in the Union is affected, innumerable cases in the county. Among other things, this report went on to mention the fact that both of the town doctors had succumbed to this pandemic. Why? Because when everyone gets sick, they go to the doctor and then the doctor gets sick. And we saw that happening in sub-Saharan Africa with Ebola. And we've seen it also with the coronavirus. It's estimated, and this is a very, very conservative estimate. Even the research article postulated that there are probably many, many more, but 15,000 nurses worldwide have died from coronavirus. And these are people that would not necessarily have succumbed to it otherwise, looking at population studies, not the elderly necessarily. I'm sure that some of the nurses were older. But being around it enough, and I can attest to the fact that not every nurse is going to be healthy. I can remember working in the OR and having some of the meals catered there, and being overworked, stressed, that kind of thing. We want to be able to take a burden off of the healthcare providers in our community by being healthy ourselves. This is the first responsibility before we run to the doctor. What can we do ourselves to make sure that we're prepared for such times? Because it could be that there are no doctors anymore because the doctors have succumbed to these pestilences. So we need to know what we can do, know the simple things. I'm not advocating you having an open heart surgery in your basement. With your own instruments or anything like that, but the simple things that you can do, that everyone can do and should do as well. Having a healthy lifestyle, being able to use some simple natural remedies. These are things that could be profound in their effect with these oncoming pestilences. Okay, let's move on here. So we talked about this pandemic. And it was caused not by coronavirus, but by an influenza virus. I read a study dealing with the 1918 influenza pandemic that suggested poorly functioning innate immune responses were the causative factor for the lethality of the 1918 pandemic. So what does that mean? What does that mean in layman's terms? Well, basically what it means is your immune system, in particular, the aspect of your immune system that is most susceptible to lifestyle intervention, I would postulate, was weakened during this time. So the people that succumbed had weakened immune responses, especially the initial immune response. And that's so important with a new virus. With viruses your body has seen before, maybe they've changed a little bit, then you have some degree of immunity still. With your humoral immune system, which is a different aspect of the immune cycle that usually kicks in a little bit later. Could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe a week later, before the humoral response really takes hold and you start producing antibodies. And at that time, it's usually pretty easy for your immune system to gain the victory. But what happens prior to that is really essential. That's the innate immune response, or its responsibility. And it's very important for us to know how to help this work correctly. So I'm going to introduce you to our friends. These are your friends and my friends. These are our immune cells, or a few of our immune cells at least. Where do they come from, first of all? Well, they come from the red bone marrow. Stem cells. And these stem cells are responsible, these particular stem cells are responsible for producing white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, and the other immune cells as well. So one aspect of the immune system that's very important to understand is that it kind of functions on the law of supply and demand. For instance, studies have found that if you have an acute viral infection, your body does not need to produce as many cells that fight bacteria. Those would be more of the neutrophils, maybe some of the monocytes. But you would not necessarily need these in large numbers because that's their main job, is to fight bacteria and or to clean up the environment there in the body. You would need more of the T and B lymphocytes, or maybe more of the natural killer cells. So that brings us to a startling revelation, and that is that if we're facing a battle on two fronts, we really need to have the immune system prepared, because some of the research that focused on the 1918 pandemic suggested that the reason people succumbed was not the initial virus. It was actually a secondary bacterial infection that came in later and caused massive pneumonia, and the people succumbed to that. So that's why it's so important to have our immune system functioning properly, so that we can even fight a battle on two fronts if we need to. Most people's immune system are not necessarily prepared to do that. So we're going to learn how we can work together with our immune system with the decisions that we make right here. Because even though we're not on the microscopic level controlling the immune cells, we control the immune cells on the macroscopic level by the decisions that we make. And I'll get into that as we go through these immune cells. We'll start out with the neutrophil. Neutrophil is the most prevalent immune cell in the bloodstream. And let my next slide here. Kind of functions as a policeman or a first responder. He's kind of on the prowl all the time, looking for bacteria, looking for interleukin 8, which is these interleukins are chemicals that are used to signal immune cells or immune system signaling cells. They also can affect other cells and tissues as well, but their primary usage is to go along the lines of an immune response. Interleukin 8 is a way that the neutrophils communicate even with each other, and they call for backup. And I'll give you an example of what that means in just a minute. If you've ever had a pustule develop, it could be a pimple or an infection, and you see a white pustule develop, well, chances are you've got neutrophils there. In fact, it's probably mostly neutrophils. And an amazing thing about the immune system is that it is so self-sacrificing. When the neutrophils commit to going into an area to fight, they never leave. They go and they fight and they perish right there. They don't necessarily migrate back out and go fight other things. They commit themselves and they're self-sacrificing. They give themselves to destroy the enemy. And just that whole law of unselfishness is, it's written in our very being. It's written in our immune cells. It's written in the interactions in between different organs and functions in the body. So we see God's handiwork even here. And God is a God of order. He wants our immune system to be orderly. Okay, let's go on here. How does the neutrophil take care of these threats? Well, it's something called phagocytosis that goes on. Let's say it came up to a bacteria. Notice this bacteria did not belong. It was not a probiotic bacteria there in the gut, which it's good to have those there. But if you have a pathogenic or disease-causing or infectious bacteria in the bloodstream, we need to get rid of that because it can cause problems. So the neutrophil can do this. It comes up alongside the bacteria and engulfs it and basically destroys it inside. Here's a picture, quite amazing picture of a neutrophil attacking and destroying an anthrax bacterium. And a lot of people will think, well, anthrax, that's really serious. Well, it is really serious, but the neutrophils are even more serious. So if we have them working, they can destroy even something like anthrax. It's really, really amazing. Now, don't go expose yourself to anthrax unnecessarily, because that's still not something we want to challenge our immune system with. But just know that God has given us an amazing, amazing army. Okay, here's a everyday occurrence that your neutrophils might have to deal with, and that is when there's a break in the skin. Oftentimes the break in the skin is also contaminated with bacteria. Well, the neutrophils will come into that area and they will penetrate through the capillary lining and through a process known as chemotaxis, they make their way over to the bacteria and they start to eat it up. They also produce these little chemical messengers known as interleukins. And in this case, it's going to be interleukin 8 that's produced, and that calls for backup. And pretty soon you have a whole host of neutrophils congregating there, eating all of those bacteria up. And that's an important thing, isn't it? Like I said before, if you've ever had a pimple, you've also had neutrophils there. And they're doing an important job. A lot of times we think, well, I don't want this. It's a very unsightly thing, and we just get rid of it. And I'm not saying you need to leave those things there, but just know that there is a physiologic process going on there that is restorative in nature. We need to learn how to work together with that process. One of the most amazing things I found in terms of a natural remedy for acne is basically simply coconut oil. Just has to be very, very pure and not oxidized. So you don't want to get the coconut oil you've had on your shelf for 5 years. You want to get something very fresh, very new, that is full of the broad spectrum of acids, of fatty acids that are found naturally in the coconut. Because I believe it's lauric acid or stearic acid, I can't remember, one of the two. But 40% of the coconut fatty acids are comprised of this, and it's very anti-inflammatory, it's antibacterial, and I found it worked tremendously. It's tremendously helpful for people I found that have recurring acne that nothing else really seems to help. And that's not the only thing. There are a lot of other aspects of a healthy lifestyle that need to go on. It's not a cure-all, but it sure seems to help a lot of people. And I'm sure your neutrophils would be happy too, because it lessens the burden that they have. Anytime we can lessen the burden on the immune system, that's going to allow for more troops to be directed in another direction. And that's important. Remember, if we're fighting a battle on two fronts, our forces are going to be divided. They're going to be somewhat weakened. But if we can take care of maybe one of these fronts and allow the immune system to fight the thing that we can't see or can't necessarily do too much about, then all the better in terms of the outcome. Okay, let's go on here. Basophils. Basophil is a cell that a lot of people do not like, and this is the reason why. It releases histamine. And this is part of the normal inflammatory response, a normal immune response. I can remember sitting in microbiology class and my professor was going over the process of histamine. And I grew up on antihistamines. I had so many allergies when I was a young lad. I probably went through every single type of antihistamine regimen that you can think of. The dread one was the Benadryl. When that one came out, I went to sleep or I was grumpy the whole day. And I didn't like these side effects, but I never realized that it could actually cause some not so good effects on the immune system. I asked my professor, I said, well, it sounds like you're saying that histamine is important for the immune system. And if you block histamine, could that theoretically increase the risk of infection? And he said, yes. It looked like he hadn't thought about that before, but he said yes. And so I realized, wow, I've been doing myself a disservice all those years, blocking the histamine when it's potentially a part of the immune response. Now, a lot of people have overactive immune responses with the allergies. And so, yes, the histamine becomes a burden to you. But know this, it is a part of the regular immune response. It's necessary as well. Why is that? I'll show you my next slide here. Because when the neutrophils or other cells need to penetrate through the capillary wall, this is leaving the bloodstream and going into the tissue to take care of the threats, they need to have enough room to squeeze through. Because the capillary wall, the junctions between the cells are very tight. But what histamine does, it actually opens those up a little so that the immune cells can migrate into the tissue and can destroy the microorganisms that are there. So histamine is important during an infection. You need to have histamine working properly so that your neutrophils or other cells that need to migrate through the capillary walls can do so in a very timely and easy manner. So what can we do then if we're having major allergic responses? We'll talk about that in just a second. Let's first mention the allergy triggered immune cell, eosinophils. Eosinophils, they'll fight parasites also, but they're very active in allergic type immune responses. If you have your blood work done and you notice eosinophils are elevated, it's probably because of one of those two things, either severe allergies or parasitic infestation, those two things. So very important then for us to understand what we can do, not only to fight allergies, but also to fight parasites. And what can we do to fight allergies? Well, I'll give you my protocol for allergies. And as one who has suffered with allergies my whole life, over 40 years, actually, I don't remember when I was a baby, but I heard that I did have allergies even then. I found some very, very helpful things. The very first, this is not the first thing I learned, but the most powerful thing to fighting allergies. It's very simple. You don't even have to take anything. You don't even really have to do anything. It's called fasting. You have to deny appetite for at least 18 hours. It's an 18-hour fast. And what happens is a compound known as hydroxybutyrate. It's a ketone body that's produced when fat is metabolized in the body. Hydroxybutyrate is produced in large amounts, and the studies show after about 18 hours. And I testify to that because when I learned about this and I started to endure this fast, and by the way, I know it's not easy for a lot of people to fast. It's something that it takes practice, and sometimes you have to do modified fast to get started with it. But if you can start fasting more periodically, it's wonderful for your health, especially for allergies, because after 18 hours, studies have found that the hydroxybutyrate levels rise significantly in the bloodstream, and allergic responses go down significantly. So, and hydroxybutyrate is thought to be the causative compound for that. Now, some people will say, well, I'm going to go out and buy my own hydroxybutyrate as a supplement. I want to caution you on that because the body knows how to use it at the right time. Oftentimes, if we take one of these supplements that's an isolated supplement that's responsible for a very dramatic physiologic response in the body, and we take it irresponsibly, we don't know what the outcome is going to be. For instance, melatonin supplementation during the day can increase the risk of breast cancer, which during the night, it can decrease the risk of breast cancer. So the way that God has designed it for us to have is really going to be the best way we can get it. So some of you might think, well, I don't want to fast. Well, there are some other options with hydroxybutyrate. One of them is exercise. And exercise enough, not necessarily severely intensive exercise, but it needs to be an endurance-related exercise where your body is starting to burn the fat that we carry around with us. You'll start to produce this hydroxybutyrate as well. And that helps with exercise, with allergies. So exercise, who would have thought just a nice regimen of exercise could help prevent allergies? Who would have thought just one day of fasting could help prevent severe allergic responses? In fact, in the study that I looked at, that I'm referencing, I believe it was on mice, and it found that after this 18-hour fast, in fact, I think they pushed it to 24 hours just to make sure, they subjected the mice to an antigen or allergic trigger that would have normally caused anaphylaxis and would have killed the mice. But these mice, no problem, no anaphylaxis, because the hydroxybutyrate levels were there because they had been fasting. So very, very powerful modality for allergies. And that can decrease the burden on not only your eosinophils, but also your basophils. So right there, we have a couple simple things we can do to decrease the numbers of these cells that are not necessary. So then what can we do? We can focus on cells that are more important for the threat at hand. So we're not unnecessarily fighting a battle on two fronts. Okay, what about parasites? Well, here's a really amazing story. there's a compound that's known as cucurbitacin. It's found in pumpkin and squash seeds, and it's found to fight all sorts of parasites, not only intestinal, but also bloodborne. Because they don't do testing on people necessarily bringing about a malarial response and then testing them with the antidote, because that would be considered unethical. They use the animal model of malaria, which is the Plasmodium burgii, and it functions very similar to bloodborne parasite as well. But what they found with this model, which should correlate at least in some degree with malaria, is that the cucurbitacin shut down the parasite's intracellular development. So it could not develop inside of the cell just because you had these seeds. And who created these seeds? God did. God put these seeds in the fruit, I believe, for a twofold purpose. One of them is to protect the fruit from becoming wormy too early on. Why? Because he wanted us to enjoy them. And secondly, because he wanted us to enjoy them and to reap some of the benefits of these anti-parasitic functions. Give an example, and there are a lot of studies that look at this compound, the cucurbitacin, that's found in these members of the squash family and the papaya family. What it found was, or this one study, that when worms were exposed to these compounds, like I'm getting some feedback there. Okay, when worms were exposed to these hopefully that fixed it. Okay, when worms were, maybe someone's unmuted there. It needs to be muted. Thought that was me for a minute. Okay, when worms were exposed to these compounds, the time of paralysis was under 2 minutes. Both of these compounds that were found in crude extract of papaya and crude extract of pumpkin seed. So within 2 minutes, the worms were paralyzed, and then they were killed within 4 minutes for the papaya seed. Papaya seed is a little bit more potent for its anti-parasitic action, and pumpkin seeds killed them before the 5-minute mark was over. So what can we do potentially to reduce our risk of parasites? Well, of course, making sure that we're eating clean. And if we have pets, we'll wash our hands, make sure our pets are eating clean as well. Wash our hands before we're eating, of course. But also maybe some of these simple things we can do to help decrease the burden of parasites in our body, which should help also with the eosinophil levels, because they don't necessarily need to be elevated. If they don't need to be elevated, let's reduce the number because of the decisions that we make. So we're kind of the 5-star general of our immune system, and we can be a good general or we can be a bad general based on the decisions that we make. Okay, next immune cell here is the macrophage. Macrophage is a very large cell. If you look at it under a microscope, it's much bigger than any other immune cell, very easy to recognize. And it's kind of like this lumbering giant. And I would compare it to, well, kind of like a special forces, just this huge, massive special forces soldier who goes around, and he's also very particular about being clean. In fact, macrophages are kind of the body's custodian as well, because that's something they can do. They'll go around and they'll shoot out these appendages, and they'll grab hold of necrotic tissue or cellular debris or intracellular debris, and they'll bring it in and they'll take care of it. They'll, if it's something they can dispose of internally, they'll do that. It's quite amazing. They are a marine-like soldier. You won't necessarily find high levels of macrophages on your lab report because they don't reside primarily in the bloodstream. They reside in the bloodstream as monocytes, and then they find a place to live, and then they convert into what we call macrophages. They become resident macrophages. And to give you an example of how this works, let's say the macrophage decided to go into the lungs. Well, they would become alveolar macrophages, such as this alveolar macrophage right here. He's there in the alveoli, in the grape-like clusters, the microscopic grape-like clusters in the lungs. And he's there to clean up the place if it becomes a little untidy. And what he will do is
You're muted. Wrong.
okay, that's better, right?
Okay.
All right, is everyone with me so far? Everyone, okay, you're understanding pretty well. Okay, good. Let's get back into the slide here. Alveolar macrophage. He is an exciting immune cell. He's also known as a dust cell because he'll go around and clean up dust. And that's important because we're breathing in dust all the time. And if he wasn't functioning properly, our lungs would become a very easy prey for bacterial infection or fungal infection. So we can be very thankful for these immune cells. Interesting study that looked at alveolar macrophages and the 1918 strain of influenza found that when mice were exposed to a chemical that destroyed the alveolar macrophages, they had severe infections and very high mortality rates from the 1918 strain of influenza because it's so important for the alveolar macrophages to be there doing their job. And if the air that we breathe is high in particulate matter, so a lot of dust, then that's not going to be good because they're going to be working overtime just clearing out the dust when they could be potentially clearing out maybe dead tissue from viral infected cells, keeping the place clean. And keep in mind, if viruses are invading cells and the cells are exploding through apoptosis, which is programmed cellular death, happens in late stage viral infection of the cell, the alveolar macrophage can be there to clean it up before the virus can spread all over the place and make a mess. So alveolar macrophages are so important. What can we do then to increase the health of our alveolar macrophage? Well, one of the things is that we can stop smoking if we're smoking. And I know that it's possible by God's grace and mercy. I'm living proof of that. You can stop smoking by God's help and only by God's help, I believe. Even those that stopped smoking and didn't realize they were stopping by God's help. You need God's help to stop. A lot of these addictive things we can't break free on our own, but God can give us the victory. So stop smoking. Also, make sure our homes are properly ventilated. If we see a lot of dust in our homes, it would behoove us to ventilate the home and allow that dust to go outside. Studies have found, according to the EPA, that indoor air is 3 to 5 times more polluted than outdoor air. Now, if you're in the city and you're concerned about smog, well, the best time to open your windows is during the morning because that smog settles on the ground because it's not being hit and charged by the sunlight, it settles on the ground during the night. And so first thing in the morning, open up your windows, let the fresh air come in. Not only will you be releasing some of those particles, you'll also be getting higher concentrations of oxygen because indoor air, I think the statistic is anywhere from 18 to 19% oxygen. While outdoor air has quite a bit more, at least 19 to 20, maybe even 21% oxygen, depending on where you live. So it's very important for us to ventilate our homes. We can't overlook that. Even though we can't see microscopically what's going on, we need to realize that it is a very important habit to get into. Open our windows, open our doors, and let some fresh air come in. If you can get a HEPA filter and run that and clear out some of the dust, that's also important. But I would say the most important thing still is going to be to ventilate. Even if you have these expensive filters, still ventilate because you're going to not be able to trap all of the particulate matter with a HEPA filter, and you're not going to be able to get rid of the volatile compounds necessarily with the HEPA filter. Compounds such as inflammatory compounds that are released through the lungs. One of those most notably is prostaglandin E2, which is responsible for a lot of the aches and pains during acute infection. That is, it's released through the lungs. And so it goes out into the air around us. And interesting, Ellen White said that we can grow sick from breathing the air that has been exhaled by a sick person. And I think that's part of the reason. Not only can you become infected, but just the sickness itself, all the inflammatory compounds that are being exuded out of the lungs, maybe sweat out, and we can breathe that in. That's why it's so important for us to ventilate and let fresh air come in. Really, really amazing study here. Psalms 51:10, it says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Why do I bring this out? Well, because the slide next to it shows cardiac muscle tissue with these little dots all over. And this cardiac muscle cell or tissue is not striated in the way that it should be. It's actually rotting. It's decaying. It's necrotic tissue. This is, I think, 3 to 5 days post heart attack. Myocardial ischemia has set in, and the tissue is not getting oxygenated, so it died. Well, God has a plan for restoration. As soon as the injury happens, he's already on the move with these white blood cells. These are macrophages that are here. Thousands upon 10,000s of macrophages going into the heart and cleaning it out. That's amazing. And that's God's hand guiding these white blood cells. So we can be co-laborers with God in making sure that we have a healthy heart and a healthy body. Okay, go on here. Now, by the way, these were lymphocytes. We're going to get into the leukocytes. Oh, am I getting that mixed up? Yeah, I did. Okay, T cells, lymphocyte here. This is a very, very important set of cells if we want to have immunity and we want to have a robust immune response against a virus, especially long term. And there are a number of different types of T cells. We have the killer T cell, kind of the infantryman of the T cell family. The helper T cell, we mentioned 100% of people with the original SARS virus had decreased levels of the helper T cells, and that was not a good thing. And also we have the regulatory T cells. These cells are interesting because they don't fight. They actually tell the body that it's time to stop fighting. And that's important because there should be times of activity and times of rest for the immune response. A lot of people get into trouble with autoimmune responses because there's never a time to rest. The immune system is always on active duty, and it can become worn out, or maybe that even precipitates an autoimmune disease because of the impairment of the immune system having to constantly work and struggle against a certain enemy. Could even be ourselves. We're our own enemy in that aspect with autoimmune diseases. So this is referred to as the humoral immune response. Humoral immune response with the T cells, also with something I didn't mention. I need to go back here and talk about the B cells. Will kind of form your guard for infections that your body has seen before. And this is very important because if you ever had chicken pox as a child and you're exposed to it later, you probably will not get chicken pox when you even the shingles, I should say, when you're older. And studies have found that if you get a chicken pox vaccine as opposed to the coming down with the actual virus, you're much more likely to get shingles later on. So that's why if you grew up and you got a chickenpox vaccine, it's highly recommended out there that you get the shingles vaccine as well. I'm not going to get into that. It's kind of a controversial issue, but I will say this, the body knows how to do it better. So it's really amazing that even with all of our scientific research and precise methods, we still cannot replicate how the precision that God has placed in the immune system. Very, very amazing, and quite a bit of potential here. Okay, let's talk about the B cell. What does the B cell do? Well, he's kind of like our enemy intelligence officer. He devotes himself at one point in time to fighting a particular attacker, a single attacker. And this could be even a protein that he decides he's going to fight. What happens is a cell that presents these proteins, called an antigen presenting cell. This would be the helper T cell in this case. Helper T cell comes up to the B cell and it brings this little protein fragment and it confers with the B cell. The helper T cell says, I don't think this belongs in the body. What do you think? And this B cell says, you know what? I think you're right. I'm going to dedicate my whole life, my whole existence to fighting this threat. And what he does then is he transforms himself. He clones himself, replicates himself, so that there are many, many more who say, now we're all going to fight this single threat. And they start to produce antibodies, thousands of antibodies in a few seconds even. It's amazing how many antibodies can be produced. And what do these antibodies do? Well, they will go throughout the bloodstream. They will adhere themselves to the areas where that protein or that antigen is found. Sometimes they'll neutralize the problem, even in so doing that, or they'll at the very least, they'll target it for the immune system. So the immune system could say, hey, there's a foe over there. We very easily can get rid of it because he knows exactly where it is because of the antibodies. So it's very important for us to be able to produce antibodies, not only for long-term immunity, but also for finishing off a threat in the body. Here's a really amazing natural remedy, not for everyone, and we'll discuss why, but many of you know this as echinacea or purple coneflower. It's been found that echinacea boosts the immune response by decreasing the number and activity of the T regulatory cells. Do you remember what those do? The T regulatory cells, they basically call the fight off. So if you have less of these and less activity of the cells that call the fight off, what are you going to have? You're going to have more fighting. So the immune system is going to be more active because of that one action of echinacea. But also echinacea increases the number and activity of helper T cells. So the helper T cells are going around trying to find threats, and they're bringing it to the B lymphocytes, and the B lymphocytes are potentially going to be able to start producing antibodies quicker because of this natural stimulation that's occurring due to the echinacea. It's quite amazing. Now, that being said, echinacea is not for everyone, because what if you have an autoimmune disorder? Do you really want to have a flare-up? Do you really want to increase the severity of the attack that's ongoing already with the autoimmune response? No, that's why it's not recommended. It's contraindicated to take echinacea during an autoimmune response. And that could be any number of these depicted and even more. So it's very important for us to know our bodies, know our needs. Not every herb is going to work for us, but there are things that in general are going to be helpful. We know the laws of health are important for everyone, and not everyone can maybe have the same experience with exercise, but everyone does need to move. Everyone does need to have at least some aerobic exercise and even some anaerobic exercise as well. Good for the brain, good for the body, good for the hormones. But the laws of health are something that we can't negate. This is a baseline of health. Herbs, natural remedies, they're not going to fit with everyone's physiology or needs, but I encourage you to study those things out, because you can find things, even with autoimmune conditions, you can find simple remedies in nature that could assist the body's natural process of healing. And I'll leave it at that. Let's go into my last immune cell here, which is the natural killer cell. Very, very important. And we saw that with the original SARS, this was decreased in about 50% of individuals. I would submit to you that those 50% probably also succumbed to a fatal infection. Why is that? Because without the natural killer cell, you have lost your first line, major first line of defense with these viral threats. The natural killer cell is the innate immune response special forces. What do I mean by innate immune response? Well, the innate immune response, remember, is kind of the first stage of the immune response. It comes before, in terms of a new threat, it comes before the humoral response, where your body produces antibodies. It could take a little while before the humoral response kicks in. So the innate immune response needs to be functioning properly so that you can, during the meantime, you can make headway against this threat. This is, as it says on the slide, my favorite immune cell. It's also known as the cancer neighborhood watch. Forms something called the tumor surveillance system. And what it does is it can go and find cancerous cells when nobody else can. It has permission just because of who it is. And I'm not sure if I have that in my slides. I do have that in a cancer presentation, but it's an amazing cell. And it also is one of the most profoundly affected cells in regards to lifestyle. So the choices that we make can make or break our natural killer cells. And we'll talk about some of those in just a minute. But first I want to go to this slide. Very, very amazing research right here. 2004, researchers found that therapeutic agents that bolster the innate immune response, including activation of natural killer cells, should be the target of future studies. Why? Because it found that mice that had adequate levels of natural killer cells, when they were confronted with the Zaire Ebola virus, which is that real dangerous strain that was prominent there in sub-Saharan Africa a number of years ago, that had a very high mortality rate. These mice had no problem overcoming this Ebola virus because their natural killer cells could seek out and destroy them very effectively. That's so amazing. Another study that looked at natural killer cells and SARS, the original coronavirus. When I say original coronavirus, I'm talking about dangerous pandemics. We know that coronavirus has been around for a long time. It's also one of the viruses responsible for the common cold. But SARS, the original SARS, was not a unique, or it was unique. It was not a simple, unobtrusive virus. It had a very high mortality rate. Okay, so this is what the study said. The number of natural killer cells changed in patients with SARS and correlated with the disease severity. So the more severe the infection, what happened? They noticed that there were less natural killer cells. I know this is kind of a correlation, but it's logical that we can deduce there is a significant risk in having low numbers of natural killer cells. Just by its physiologic function, natural killer cells being able to go and to fight these new viruses, it's so important for us to have them because we want to be able to not succumb to these threats. So natural killer cells. What can we do to help our natural killer cells? Well, here's one. Taking time to rest. This is vital. Vital. Studies have found that melatonin, when it's secreted in its proper time, that's especially during the first few hours of sleep, increases significantly the number and the function of the natural killer cells. So number and function of natural killer cells by getting a good night's sleep. If you're having trouble with a good night's sleep, there are a lot of things that you can do naturally. I have a video on YouTube called 7 Steps to a Good Night's Sleep. If you want to go to Ron Meinhardt, my YouTube channel, you can watch that even tonight and you can get a good night's sleep if you're having trouble. So just type in Ron Meinhardt on YouTube and look for 7 steps for a good night's sleep. Go through some simple lifestyle factors and natural remedies that could be helpful for that. But it is so important for us to get good sleep for a number of reasons, not just to have our bodies primed to fight viruses, but because 90% of healing and growth, it's been estimated, takes place while we sleep. the effect of sleep on our cognition is huge. In fact, if we go through a period of time in which we are having troubled sleep, we're at much greater risk for mental disease, for memory impairment, for cognitive decline. Why? Because the brain heals during sleep. If you think about it this way, when is the brain in its resting state? Well, you said prayer, yeah, that's the time. The brain does rest somewhat, but it also needs its really good rest. And that takes place only during delta wave sleep, which occurs when you're really out, when you're really taking a nice deep sleep. The compounds that are produced, like prolactin and growth hormone, very, very important for just having a good quality of life in general, and also repairing the brain. So very, very important. What's another thing that we can do for natural killer cells? Exercise. Studies have found that when we combine exercise with two other factors, being outdoors and also cold. Now, I know this picture doesn't look cold, but if you're in North America, you're starting to see outside your window cold environment. And some people say, well, that's when I'm going to stop exercising because I don't like to exercise when it's cold. If you can convince yourself to exercise in the cold weather, I'm not saying you should go out and become chilled, bundle up if you have to, go out and exercise. Studies have found that you're going to have much more benefit than you realize. It's not just about your heart or your lungs or weight loss. It's also your immune system that will be benefited tremendously. Lymphatic flow increases. You get your blood, your immune cells that are there in the lymphatic system get out into the bloodstream much more readily when you're exercising. But specifically, natural killer cells are increased when we exercise, especially in the cold. Another thing that we can do is exercise and then be exposed to cold for short durations. What I like to do, and this is not for everyone, I know, is exercise and then, if I'm able, maybe take a warm shower and finish with cold. This is something you kind of have to get used to, and it's not for everyone. As I said, some people have something called a vasovagal response, and they'll pass out and bump their head in the bathtub. So it's something that should be done cautiously. But everyone can go outside and exercise when it's cold, when it's not so desirable, because you're going to receive an amazing benefit. Another benefit of outdoor exercise is you breathe in the fresh air, breathe less particulate matter, and the particulate matter that you do breathe in is immunostimulatory, potentially, if you're in a natural place. Hopefully it's not causing an allergy, which would be not a very good immunostimulation. But if you're breathing in something that you're not allergic to, and let's say an essential oil from one of these trees. I don't see any pine trees in this picture, but we'll talk about pine. Pine is one of the compounds, not one of the compounds. It's one of the sources of one of the most potent compounds responsible for increasing levels and function of natural killer cells. One study found that the alpha pinene and beta pinene that are part of the essence that emanates from the needles of the pine. So the pine essential oil, the oil that you're smelling, the volatile, evaporative oils that you smell that smell so good when you take some pine needles and crush them and smell, or you can go out and buy pine oil if you want to as well. But the amazing thing is that these things have been found to tremendously increase natural killer cell function. One study done in Japan actually looked at a group of people that went to a pine forest or evergreen forest, and they call this forest bathing in Asian countries. You go and you're bathing in the forest. It's an amazing experience because you're allowing the natural essences, you're breathing those in, and studies found that this group that went to the pine forest there in Japan had natural killer cell levels increased, their functions increased, Levels of intracellular anti-cancer proteins increased as well, and the effect lasted up to 7 days. So a whole week just because of one day, making one trip to the forest. Some of you might live in the city and you might not find a pine tree anywhere, or you may live in an area where there's no pine trees. But there's even hope, even if you can't get out of the city. But I want to recommend go to the forest. If you can go out to some aspect of nature, it's not only going to be helpful with what you smell, but what you see, or maybe what you don't see. It's a way to de-stress for a lot of people. But let's say you're in an urban environment and you want to do something right away to help with your natural killer cell levels. Well, not same researchers, but same country, Japan, origin of this research study, found that when they gathered together a group of healthy young men and they subjected them to pine essential oil. So they allowed a vaporizer to run with pine essential oil wafting out of it 3 nights. And they only spent the night at these hotel rooms. They went to work and they came back, but they spent every night, 3 nights, subjected to this fragrance from the pine essential oil. What the study found was amazing. It found that this exposure to the pinene, the alpha and the beta pinene, which are found in the oil here, significantly increased natural killer cell activity and number of natural killer cells. It also decreased cortisol levels, and that was reportedly unrelated to the increase in natural killer cell levels and vice versa. But what they found, this was the most amazing finding. The effect lasted over 30 or up to and over 30 days. 30 days. That's amazing. I just, I can't just fathom how simple this is for everyone to do. In fact, this is one of the things that we would tell everyone at our seminars. Get some pine essential oil. If you don't have pine trees around, it's a very simple thing to do. You can smell it. You can rub it on your chin. You can put it in a vaporizer. If you're in a place with pine, get some of those pine needles when you're on your walk and smell them. If you can smell the pine, you're getting the treatment. So quite amazing. Very, very simple way of increasing your natural killer cell levels. Okay, want to know what things to avoid, because this is also a very important part of a healthy lifestyle. It's not just what we do, it's also what we do not do or we choose not to do that could be helpful. One of the most dangerous things to natural killer cells is a compound known as benzopyrene. In fact, it is the anti-natural killer cell compound. It will wipe out your natural killer cell levels very quickly. It turns off the proliferation and the activity. Also is mutagenic. It causes mutations in your DNA. And what can this result in? Well, cancer. Because if you're turning off the tumor surveillance system and you're causing mutations, then you're probably going to have a higher risk of developing cancer. So where do we get the benzopyrene from? Well, I'll tell you what used to be the #1 source: cigarette smoke. Smokeless tobacco also has benzopyrene, and even coffee contains high levels of benzopyrene. Not as much as the tobacco, but still nonetheless enough to cause a suppression of natural killer cell levels. And this is from a study that was looking at especially the effects on the risk of oral cancer because of the smokeless tobacco. A lot of people think, well, smokeless tobacco, that doesn't cause a lot of harm because the tar is not there and it's not going to cause my lungs to go black and not going to get lung cancer, but you may get some other type of cancer because your natural killer cell levels are turned off. And because of that, you're at much greater risk of succumbing to viral threats, not just cancer, because natural killer cells fight viruses and cancer as well. Okay, now a lot of people have either quit smoking now or they're staying away from cigarette smoking. You may be thinking, well, I'm okay. Well, there are other areas in terms of lifestyle where we can get benzopyrene. We'll go through one of those right now. This is, by and large, the most dangerous and most prolific source of benzopyrene in the human diet. grilled, charbroiled meats in particular. Now, if you're looking for a safer diet, I would encourage you, if you haven't made the switch, start thinking about a plant-based diet. But let's say you still have your mind made up, and that's fine. Everyone needs to make their own decisions in this matter. And you want to choose a healthier option than the charbroiled meat. Well, you could go to just simple boiling, because that will produce less benzopyrene. It'll also be a little bit, well, not as tasty, and maybe that might help you to make the final choice there to go over to a plant-based diet. I don't have a lot of time to focus on the benefits of a plant-based diet. I'm sure that you've heard many things, but it is all that it is made up to be. It's an amazing experience. I know I didn't grow up on a plant-based diet, and I had a lot more chronic issues, allergies, and so on. But I made the switch a number of years ago, and I don't miss it. I'm very thankful. I'm very happy with the choices that I made. And I can look at this research and I can say, yes, I'm doing the right thing, because see, even the science is corroborating with this. But even if the science didn't corroborate with it, I know by faith I have to believe that in the beginning, God knew exactly the diet that humanity needed. And I think it's time that we get back to that diet because of all the disease that's found in the animal kingdom. Okay, what are some other things that can decrease the levels of decrease the levels of natural killer cells besides benzopyrene? Well, here's one: alcohol. You've heard the admonition, a little wine is good for your heart. And that's kind of a misnomer, because platelet aggregation is decreased by alcohol, because alcohol can kill and denature a lot of proteins, but it's non-specific. It's going to denature proteins in the brain and in the gut and all over the place. So you're going to be causing just devastation. The real source of the benefit, or something that's here in the glass, is the original source, which is the grape. But not just the toxic issue, but the immune impairing issue of alcohol should be considered. In this journal, Alcohol, published in 2002, it said these results, so the result of this study, results indicate that ethanol suppresses activation of natural killer cells. So you may have enough natural killer cells, but they're not doing their job because the ethanol is suppressing their activation. And that could be very, very dangerous. You know, it's interesting, because when all the restrictions were in place, and I'm not going to pick on any particular area, but I remember, especially earlier on in the pandemic, the churches were closed, but the bars were open. Now that's a little strange. I think we got that one backwards, because the bars are definitely a place where you're going to suppress your ability to fight. And I would hope that the church is a place where you're going to enable your ability to fight. Okay, let's talk about the grapes. Grapes are a great option for promoting natural killer cell activity. There's a compound that's found in grapes called resveratrol, and a study found that it not only inhibited platelet aggregation, and this was a specific function, it did not denature proteins across the board, but it helped with the clotting aspect, so decrease the risk of heart disease for those who are prone to it. But it also, it said in the study, increased the cytotoxic activity of natural killer cells, and also increased the susceptibility of tumor cells to natural killer cells. So by and large, it was an amazing response for those natural killer cells. Not so good for cancer cells, but that's good because we don't want those anyway. And here's the last aspect I'm going to mention dealing with natural killer cell levels. You see, it's not just what we do, it's also, and it's not just the decisions that we make up here that influence the things that we do, but it's also the affect. What are we overall, what are we feeling? Because if we're feeling depressed and we're dwelling upon depressing things and anxious forebodings and these types of things, and I know it's sometimes very hard to get out of a rut of negative thinking, but here's something that should help us. Negative thinking is not a good thing for our immune response, and that probably goes without saying. But I'm going to show a few studies that I think are really profound. And let's go to the positive side first. Study involving 1-hour sessions of recreational music making in Japan. It found that in a group of elderly individuals that were given instruments to play by young visitors, they played these instruments for a whole hour and they had a great time. They didn't necessarily know, they weren't skilled musicians or anything. They just had a little diversion and encouragement from others, which is nice to have at times. And it was amazing the effect on their immune response. Not only were their smiles on their faces, but something was going on internally as well. It says in the older group, we found significant increases in the number of lymphocytes, T cells, helper T cells, memory T cells, production of interferon and interleukin 6. So the whole of the immune system was being activated and modulated. The immune system was coming into a state of readiness for potential threats that could arise. Okay, looks like I got muted there again. I'm back now. Okay, all of this was happening because of happiness, because of this pleasant experience that these individuals had. Their immune system was benefited. Now, contrary-wise, we find that subjects who are depressed and anxious, and especially higher degree of depression, they had impairments of natural killer cell levels. And found what they found as a summary in this study published in the journal Life Science in 1992 was that the higher the degree of depression, the higher the depression on natural killer cell activity. So the natural killer cells may have been there, but they were not functioning. Why? Because of the way that we were thinking. Just because of something as simple as depression, as anxiety. And that is profound because oftentimes we overlook this. We say, well, I'm doing all these things. I'm exercising, I'm eating healthy, I'm whatever it is, you know, and we're upset at our spouse. It's kind of negating everything. Or maybe we're doing things for the wrong reason. Sometimes we do things and we don't like it. Let's say we're eating a healthy meal, we just hate it, and we're really struggling to put this down our esophagus. Well, we're not going to gain the same benefit. So we need to ask God to create in us that clean heart and renew a right spirit within us, because that's the only way it's going to work. We cannot change our hearts. We can oftentimes think that we're doing things on our own with actions that we're making. But if we want to have the most profound effect, positive effect on our immune response, we have to be co-laborers with God, not only in action, but also in thought, in the way that we think, in the way that we feel. And a lot of times our feelings are wrong and we don't think there's anything that can be done about it. But God can create in us, if we take hold of his strength, it says, he will make peace with us. And that means that peace that surpasses all understanding can come over us and can even turn those blues into brightness. It can happen. And if we think about this, in Proverbs 17:22, a merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. Do we remember where the immune system emanates from? You remember? It's from the bones. So God gave us these admonitions long ago, but they're profound in their even scientific and physiologic implications. Something as simple as just having that merry heart, and that merry heart comes from casting our cares upon God. Jesus said, in this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. I know many people, especially in today's age, are struggling with depression and anxiety. There's so many things going on in the world around us that can cause us even to lose hope. lose hope in humanity, lose hope in ourselves. But God doesn't want us to look to humanity or even to ourselves. He wants us to look to him. And when we look to him, we can have that strength that not only permeates our affect and puts a smile on our face, but also can modulate and restructure that amazing army, the immune system that God has given to us that emanates there from the bones. So it's truly amazing. And it all comes down to this: to love God and keep his commandments. If you want to know how, in a summary statement, to improve your chances of overcoming a viral threat like the coronavirus, there it is. As simple as that. Love God and keep his commandments. Well, thank you all so much for enduring my presentation. I hope you learned a lot. And let's go ahead and open it up for questions if we can.
Okay, so we have already some questions. Somebody's asking about honey before allergies. Would that work?
Yes. Okay, that's a good question. So, can honey help with allergies? Okay, it's kind of a loaded question, because if we're just eating loads and loads of honey, then no, it's not going to help us at all because it's too much sugar. And when we have too much sugar, we're not going to be producing hydroxybutyrate because there's no need for it. There's no need for ketogenesis, for burning of fat, when we're constantly putting large amounts of sugar into our bodies. So moderation is really important in this aspect. The thought behind honey is that when we have honey that's been collected in our local area, it also has trace amounts of pollens that are found in our local area. And when our body is subjected to trace amounts of pollen over time, it can self-regulate. So basically the immune system says, hey, this is really not a threat. See, it's food. It's coming into the body all the time. It's not an issue. So the honey may work for some people, but it has to be combined with a healthy lifestyle, because the immune system will never self-regulate unless we have catalysts that are placed there to help it do so. For instance, vitamin D. Vitamin D is so important for helping the immune system to start functioning properly again. One study found that vitamin D helped the immune system, T cells in particular, to stop attacking self cells. So it's very important. Where do we get the vitamin D? From the sun. That's the best place. So honey, yes, in moderation, it's a great thing, your local raw honey, but make sure it's combined with a healthy lifestyle.
Another question is for young kids, they're specifically asking for a 10-year-old, because you were talking about fasting. So would you recommend a 10-year-old doing some fast?
That's a good question. I don't want to become your 10-year-old's worst enemy, but I will say this, that I've had 10-year-olds myself, and we've got a few that are going to be 10 years old eventually as well. And I'd say make it a pleasurable thing if you're going to do some fasting. Now, with this type of fast, it doesn't have to be a total abstinence from food. There are various types of fasts that you can do. In this case, it's a ketogenic fast. Now, I'm not one of the individuals that would postulate that you should be on long-term ketogenesis. That's not healthy. That wreaks havoc on your on many systems in the body. But short-term ketogenic fasts, I think they're beneficial, especially if it's done healthfully. Now, how could you do that? Well, when I did my first 18-hour fast, I did a salad with macadamia nuts on top, and not a whole lot of carbs there. And sure enough, after 18 hours, I wasn't very hungry because I did that, but I was able to have that hydroxybutyrate levels elevated, as evidenced by my total suppression of allergic symptoms that were happening quite severely prior to that. So there are modified fasts that you can do. I don't know if a complete fast, now, by the way, when I say fast, I don't mean restricting water. It's very important for us to have water during fasting. But I don't think it would be physiologically dangerous to fast a few meals for a child, but that could be something that you'd want to look at with your own child's history in mind, because some might not tolerate fasting as well as others. Depends if they have, like, let's say type 1 diabetes or something like that. But children have gone hungry a day and been okay. I'll just put it at that. A lot of children.
Good. So it's
So
today.
it's not something that we should be completely aghast about, our children fasting for a day, but it could be very helpful if they're having severe allergies.
Okay. Another question is for parasites. The pumpkin and papaya need to be raw or cooked?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's a heat intolerance issue with cucurbitacin, but I will say this, probably the best way to have these seeds is to soak them and then to eat them raw. If you're just looking to get rid of the parasites, because I know the studies that were done on raw seeds.
Great. So you talk about also the very negative effect of eating grilled meat. So somebody asked, how about char grilled vegetables?
That's a very good question. If you want to know the benzopyrene content of select foods, you can go, I believe it's to the USDA website, and they have a whole list of foods that are high in benzopyrene. And as far as I know, char grilling or burning foods is going to be a potential risk. We really should avoid burning foods, because I remember a few years ago, I had a friend who would burn his toast intentionally. And he said, Ron, look, I'm making some activated charcoal over here. And I didn't know any better. I thought, hey, that kind of makes sense. But activated charcoal is hard wood that has been burned until you have nothing but the carbon left. If you're burning foods, you're creating some pretty potent toxins potentially, because it's going to be burning fats, you're burning proteins, and you could cause some pretty undesirable compounds. So really should avoid burning food in general. It's really a good rule of thumb.
Great. We have several questions. The next one is, can a person get COVID again if you have already gotten it previously?
Well, that's the suggestion with the media, looking at a few cases. I think with any infection, there's a possibility of getting it again. It depends upon the dose of the virus that the immune system received, and the how the virus was fought off. Because let's say that you had an infection and you suppressed it with some type of outward force, let's say antibody cocktail or something like President Trump got. You may not have your own immune response built up for that again. You may be able to get it again. That's why I think the best way of fighting the second battle is to fight the first one properly. And that is to have a healthy, robust immune response. And hopefully you will have enough of those B lymphocytes that have dedicated their lives to destroying the pathogen should it appear again. Now, that being said, when the B lymphocytes have finished their battle, a lot of them will die off, and you'll have a few that'll come back and reside in the lymphatic vessels, and they'll wait until they're triggered again. Then they can start the whole response of cloning themselves and reproducing themselves to a massive state again. If we are damaging our lymphatic vessels, then we could be damaging those cells as well. Now, how do we damage lymphatic vessels? Well, the lymphatic vessels are kind of the vacuum cleaner in between the cells. And they'll also suck up fats from the digestive tract, or fat soluble things from the digestive tract. So if we're eating a lot of, let's say, rancid fats, toxic fats, hydrogenated fats, trans fats, I would think you could be doing some major damage, not only to the lymphatic system, but also to the cells that reside there. That's just my opinion. I don't have any research, but it seems to make physiologic sense. So yes, I believe that you could come down with an infection again,
Mhm.
but it's much less likely if you have a properly functioning immune response the first time.
Mhm. Okay, great. We have short time and we have a lot of questions, so let's see if we can get through it. Any recommendations to boost immune system against bacterial skin infection and ideas to fight it?
Okay, this is a good question because skin infections, you can see them and you can kind of help the immune system even a little bit more than, let's say, a pneumonia. You're not going to reach down there and apply a salve to the alveoli. But skin infections, you can apply topical things. Like I said, the coconut oil. Now, here's one that I've had recent experience with, and have a friend that's a doctor that used this before I really started getting into it, which was oregano oil, diluted oregano oil and olive oil, more olive oil than oregano, but nonetheless, profound effect on bacterial skin infections from what I've seen. I don't have any
Awesome.
evidence to really highlight that, but as far as I know, there are some studies now that are showing oregano, the carvacrol compound that's found in oregano oil, very potent antibacterial, that could be applied topically when properly diluted.
Mhm.
So something you could research out a little bit more. But there are plenty of natural remedies that would play an assistive role in helping with the cleanliness, with the barrier protection for a bacterial skin infection. I'm not sure exactly what infection you're referring to, but people have in the past you've used aloe vera gel with good effect for these types of things. Certain essential oils show antibacterial activity, but just keeping it clean is one of the most important things that we can do. Keeping it clean, keeping it in its keeping it from spreading through making sure if it's, well, I think I'm getting into a little bit more detail than I need to. Just keep in mind, if you have a severe bacterial skin infection, you probably need to get it checked out to make sure that you're doing the right thing. I've had individuals that have done really amazing things with bacterial skin infections, even ulcers, like diabetic ulcers. But you need to make sure you're doing the right thing, because you can have more severe infection result if you're not following the proper protocols. So find
So
someone who knows about these things and show them your specific ailment and go from there. Is my
we
suggestion.
had very good success with onion. Just the onion in the areas is super effective. But really quick,
Excellent.
can you answer on the mask? Somebody said you say you will talk about wearing mask later. So what about it?
Okay, this is my can of worms to open up here at the end. Okay,
We still have few more
I'm gonna make a statement first of all, and that is that I'm not an anti-masker. Okay, I don't believe that masks should never be worn, but I believe that you should know what masks do to you physiologically, so that you can mask when totally necessary and unmask when possible. And specifically, we'll consider this first of all. We know that proper ventilation is very important for health, right? Fresh air is one of the laws of health, correct? And if we are occluding fresh air in our homes or stopping the inflow of fresh air into our homes, we're going to cause problems long term. Well, the same holds true with having a local occlusion of the fresh air with wearing a mask. If we're not able to properly ventilate, we could have higher levels of maybe some of the toxic byproduct or toxic exudants like prostaglandin E2 or other inflammatory compounds that are coming out into the mask. We definitely have higher levels of CO2. And I haven't really bought into, I guess you could say, just the hearsay on the masks and the mask issue. So I went and I did the research myself post-COVID. There's a lot of research on especially N95 particulate respirators or the N95 masks that are worn by healthcare providers. And the basic consensus in the studies is that after a number of hours, especially, you start to have high levels of CO2 in the bloodstream. Why? Because you are occluding, and you're supposed to have these fit very well. I remember working in the OR and even on the floor as a nurse, having to do fit testing to make sure my N95 was getting the proper size of N95 mask, and I knew how to fit it to my face, how to conform it to my face, so that you wouldn't have any air leaks. And that is what causes the increase of the CO2. So not every mask is going to do that. The surgical mask, you have plenty of space outside the mask where you have the ventilation occurring. Surgical mask, which is a mask you put here, right here, and you tie or you loop over your ears. By the way, I kind of think that we're going to have a epidemic of these forward set ears after a year of this in the United States. But anyway, getting back to my spiel here, we're going to have ventilation occurring through the surgical mask unless it is fit so tightly that there's no air gap, there's no space for air to leave. The purpose of the surgical mask is not to filter all of the incoming air. It may filter a little bit, but the purpose of the surgical mask is to stop the forceful projection of particles. So when we're talking, it's to stop the saliva that would fly out and hit someone unknowingly and maybe have a large viral load on it and cause an infection. In the OR, surgical masks are worn so that we don't inadvertently salivate and microscopic particles onto the operating table or the patient there, and thus increasing the risk of an infection. So there's a time and a place to wear the surgical mask, and there's also a time and a place to wear the N95 masks. But some people are going around and wearing the N95 mask all the time. And so according to the research, they're going to be causing a syndrome called hypercapnia, which is elevated levels of CO2 in the bloodstream. And here's why that could be a very bad thing, because there are studies that show that hypercapnia or elevated levels of CO2 shuts down an enzyme that's responsible for arming the white blood cells. It's called NADPH oxidase. And high levels of CO2 shut down NADPH oxidase. NADPH oxidase is a universal suppressant. CO2 is a universal suppressant of NADPH oxidase. So what does that mean? It means that if you're wearing these tightly occlusive masks for long periods of time, you could be decreasing the ability of your white blood cells to fight infections because they're not able to produce the reactive oxygen species that destroy through phagocytosis, destroy these problems. So, my basic spiel is, or take home message is, know what mask fits you and fits your circumstance. Because if you're working around asbestos, yep, put on the N95 respirator. You want to filter all that out. If you're just going to the grocery store, you don't need an N95 respirator. You can wear a surgical mask and be much better off.
Okay, good. Can you overdose on vitamin D?
Well, it's not the vitamin D that you'll overdose on, it's the calcium. Because if you're taking too much vitamin D for long periods of time, then you definitely can absorb too much calcium from the gut and develop hypercalcemia, which can cause arrhythmias and all sorts of things, dangerous. But you'll never overdose on vitamin D from the sun. So there's the best source right there. Don't get a sunburn because that's not going to help you with developing vitamin D anyway. So be out in the sun as much as you can without the reddening, and you're going to be producing large amounts of vitamin D without a risk of overdosing through the hypercalcemia. That being said, I'm not opposed to using vitamin D as a supplement, but you need to know there are safety recommendations. For most people, Actually, I just read a study that said don't ever make safety recommendations for people because everyone's needs vary. But in general, generally speaking, most adults can get by with 3,000 to 4,000 IUs of vitamin D a day. For certain acute situations, some doctors will prescribe 10,000 IUs for a couple days just to get over a crisis or to bring up really low levels. But it definitely should not be done for longer periods of time.
Awesome. So there is another quick question. What can be done to help chronic, very dry, cracked hands? Lotions and wearing gloves does not provide lasting relief. Isn't it like here's a problem with nutrition, right?
Well, it's very possible. It could be a problem with hydration. That would be my first step, is to make sure that the person is adequately hydrating, drinking plenty of water throughout the day. For most people, that looks like 8 to 10 to 12 glasses of water a day. If you're sweating, perspiring a lot, then that could be more. You could have skin irritation resulting from a cosmetic as well, a lotion, a soap. So that's one thing to consider. Could be that you need to switch to a more natural soap for a little while and see if that helps. I remember when I used to work in the OR and using the really, some of the soaps there wreak havoc on your skin. So could be just the toiletries that you're using. But I think an adjuvant to skin health, things like shea butter, some of the natural butters that come from these nuts could be helpful in terms of providing a moisture. Aloe vera is a good moisture barrier. Also promotes healing of the tissues as well. But I would say, first of all, are you drinking plenty of water? That's the number one thing. I have a daughter who doesn't like to drink water, and when the seasons change, we know because she gets dry and cracked lips before anyone else does. And we have to start reminding her at that point, yep, got to drink more water, because the tissue, the skin, is one of the first organs to suffer when we become dehydrated.
Great. Face shields better than mask?
That's a good question. If you're flying on Southwest Airlines, no, they won't let you get on the plane with just a face shield. I seem to think, my own line of reasoning, that a face shield would be very effective in terms of stopping projectile saliva, especially if the face shield, it could even be more effective than a mask. If the face shield really went down all the way, I think it could be very effective. And some places will let you get by with that. But I think there's an increasing demand in terms of the type of mask that you're allowed to use in certain places. I've often thought how ludicrous it is to just give the general instruction, just wear a mask, because masks can be made out of any material. And it's kind of silly. They could be completely ineffective, looking at the mesh size of the material, or they could be so tightly woven that they're going to suffocate you too. So there's no standardization of this, and I think it's risky to have all these different types of masks out there. But I think a face shield allows you to have protection, but also to be able to ventilate properly. Unfortunately, some industries are not going to let you get by with the mask mandate being in place with wearing one. But I have seen quite a few people, local grocery store and that kind of thing, that are wearing a face shield, and they seem to be doing just fine.
Does taking vitamin K2 help calcium absorption properly into the bone rather than building up in the blood?
I'm not actually really familiar with that physiology, but I would say that if you're looking for vitamin K, definitely should be producing plenty of it if our bacteria, our flora, is functioning properly, and we'll talk about that on our next presentation, talking about the gut and gut health. So maybe we'll address that at that point. I'll look more into that, see if it is prohibitive to developing hypercalcemia. We'll respond to that in the next lecture.
So maybe Dr. Josh can tell us, there is other questions that probably gonna take longer, like diabetes
we
type
used to
1, and then we have also about eczema and probiotics. I think those are going to take longer. Perhaps we can do a part 2 and invite Dr. Diane Burnett and ourselves to help answer questions on immunity, on autoimmune disorders, things like that. What do you think?
Sure, that sounds good.
Yeah, because we ran out of time, so we probably should do part 2. Maybe, I'm not sure if Ron Meinhardt is available next Sabbath. We can do part 2. Awesome. So what do you think? Would that work? Dr.
That's
Diane
fine.
Burnett and Dr. Joyce Shea?
That's fine. That sounds good.
Okay. Dr. Diane, maybe you can tell us, send us a message, or just say yes or no for next Sabbath, and then we are all set for next time, so we can meet again at 3 o'clock. It's been a fun class. I love these classes, that these are so incredible, simple things that we can do. And, prepare, because right now we need those tips. We won't be able to buy and sell medications anymore, right? So we need to be prepared to know what to do. And that's your beautiful girl. So good to see her again. Okay, so we are going to close.